right, well, good morning, everybody. This is Jomo Stewart here at the Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation. It is Tuesday, March 30th at 8:02 in the a.m., and we are here for the Energy for All Alaska Task Force meeting. Our guest today is Mr. Jon Bittner. He is the Executive Director, State Director of the Alaska Small Business Development Center, here to give us a read on the latest COVID package and the impact of COVID-19 on Alaska. So, Mr. Bittner, if I may, I'll just hand the show over to you. Oh, well, I guess one more thing. As always, everybody knows the chat line is open. If you have any questions, you, of course, may post them there. I'll be monitoring it. But if you have questions, Director Bittner is an old hand with this group, so he knows. You all can just go ahead and take yourselves off of mute and ask your questions. All right? Well, thank you very much. All right, Mr. Bittner, sorry about that, but please. Proceed.
No, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to come back and speak to y'all. This is always a fun group to talk to. And again, if you have any, if you see anything that you can't quite read, I put this PowerPoint together myself, unfortunately, much to my staff's dismay. So some of these slides are not quite as well put together as I would like in terms of readability, but we'll see if we can get through it together. As Jomo mentioned, I'm the State Director of the Alaska Small Business Development Center. We've been around for a little over 35 years. We've got offices in 8 different locations around the state, including in Fairbanks. And we service around 2,000 small businesses directly through one-on-one business advising, and another 2,000 to 3,000 through workshops and training that we do. Our business advisors have been working pretty nonstop this last year, trying to keep ahead of all the needs of small businesses across the state. And we've really sort of tried to position ourselves as a one-stop resource for businesses who need help with COVID-19 in particular, but in general. So we've created this website here. If you or any of the businesses you know or work with need help, especially as the new round of federal funding comes through and there's new programs available, I highly recommend they check this out and stop here. We've got a lot of how-to guides, best practices, recordings of SBA webinars, things like that. So it's a good resource. To start with, I wanted to go over sort of where we're at, sort of what the impact on Alaska's businesses and its individuals has been over the last year. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the federal funding that flowed into the state, sort of the impact that's had, where it's gone, how that's been deployed. And then we're going to wrap up with an analysis of the new American Relief Plan Act, which is the $1.9 trillion relief bill that was passed just recently. And then last but not least, I'm going to talk a little bit about some survey results that we took back in December and that we will be doing again in partnership with quite a few of the Alaska State Regional Development Organizations to try and do a end of 2020, sort of beginning of 2021 comparison to see where the businesses are now and what they need specifically in terms of assistance. So now for the bad news. Things are still a little rough right now, economically speaking. The unemployment rate is somewhere around 6.5%. It fluctuates by the month, but it's a little higher than we'd like it to see. It's up from 5.1% the same time last year. Back in February 2020 compared to February 2019, more than 4,000 fewer people were employed statewide. And that's just the ones that are reporting. At this point, there could be a larger impact there that we're not seeing shake out in the data. On an individual and family level, 62,000 adults, or 13% of adults in the state, report not having enough food. 31,000 renters, this is just Alaska specific numbers, 31,000 renters, or 1/5 of all renters in Alaska, are not caught up on their rent payments. This is part of a program that allowed you to defer rent during COVID-19 in order to not lose your home, quite frankly, due to the economic impact. 179,000, or 36% of all adults, report having difficulty covering normal household expenses. So on an individual and family level, there is still a lot of financial uncertainty, a lot of tight budgets out there. And the longer this goes on before we get an economic recovery, which we're hoping will come soon, the more problems we're going to have. The rent, I apologize, the rent issue in particular is pretty concerning, because that impacts not just the individuals who would be very, very negatively impacted, but also the landlords, the folks that are providing these homes and apartments. So it's sort of a double whammy in terms of economic impact there. Now, there is funding in the new bill, and we'll talk about that, that tries to mitigate this, but whether or not it's enough to cover the liability is still, it's difficult to tell because it's hard to know exactly how big that liability is. We don't really have good data on that other than the fact that there is a problem. Last but not least, and this is one, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jomo.
There's a question in the chat box regarding rent, asking that rent is deferred, not waived.
Exactly. That's the problem. So it's the original bills did not provide funding to pay people's rent. They just gave them the ability to, if they couldn't pay rent, they also couldn't be evicted. So we've basically just been kicking this can down the road. Who knows for how long? In some cases, it could be almost a year's worth of rent that's been piling up. I don't think it's necessarily that bad in most cases, but there's definitely multiple rent payments in arrears for many of these folks. And eventually the bill's going to come due. And when that happens, I mean, even if you're back in your job, there's not a lot of employment, especially in the lower and middle income areas, that'll allow you to make up 3 or 4 months rent payments in a few paychecks. Like it's going to be a problem. Now, there is, again, some funding in the new bill that may mitigate that a bit, but I'm not sure how retroactive it is. So we have to look at that a little deeper once they start deploying that money through FEMA.
You know, we may have to have a presentation by AHFC. I know that they are running a program. The application deadline has passed, at least for the first run of applications, but that was to help renters on both their rent, outstanding rent. I believe there was an ability for some forward payment as well as utility debt that might be outstanding. But yeah, we may have to circle around for a more detailed presentation on that item.
Absolutely, and that's part of the state CARES fund distribution, as well as some additional funding through the CARES Act, and that was a great program. Now, how many folks were unable to take advantage of it is I would actually be very interested in hearing HFC's take on that, because my understanding is there's still, even with all that, there's still 1 in 5 people that have back rent due. So,
may I ask one more question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Again, we're 4,000 fewer than February 2020, but what is that against how bad it was?
How bad it was? It is getting better. That is definitely, the trend is much better, because at a while there, we were trending at double-digit unemployment. So it was 44,000 people unemployed. So we're on the upward swing for sure. The difficulty we're running into, and this last bullet kind of covers it, is now that the business community, we've got vaccination rates increasing, we're doing the best in the nation in terms of vaccinating our population. We've got, our numbers are starting to turn around. Most industries are starting to see a little bit of stabilization as local restrictions sort of ease. Restaurants are starting to open up, not fully, but more than they were. People are feeling a little more comfortable now that they're vaccinated, going out, doing things. So the businesses are starting to recover. It's still dicey. There's still a lot of nuance there, but they're nowhere near as bad as it was at the height of COVID-19 in 2020. The problem we're seeing now is, as they're starting to recover, we're realizing, and it says it down here, that state and local governments are basically where businesses were 6 to 8 months ago. And by that, I mean that they are almost all facing significant revenue shortages. The state is facing, depending on where oil is at, $1 to $2 billion revenue shortfall. According to the Alaska Municipal League, over 40 communities across the state are facing a large enough budget deficit that it outweighs the money that they'll be getting through the American Relief Plan Act. So all the local governments and municipalities will be getting a certain tranche of funding, but at least 40 of them, the money they get won't even be enough to cover the debt obligation they have right now. And so that means that you're going to start seeing a contraction and a reduction in state and local government services, or these funds that are deployed to these governments are going to be used primarily for covering those shortfalls. And sometimes, in addition, there will also be reduction. So the impact that the CARES funding had that went to state and local governments was you funded the Alaska CARES Act, you funded the AHFC program, you funded a lot of different things, targeted needs that were had across the state and in these local communities. This time around, I suspect that a larger portion of those funds is going to go to trying to stop loss these budget deficits. And that's a problem, right? I mean, as we're recovering, we can't, if we start contracting on these government services, that's going to slow down that recovery. It's going to slow down our ability to do targeted relief to our economic drivers. So we're watching that pretty closely, and that's going to be a real, a bit of a sticking point, unfortunately, that we're a little worried.
So not out of the woods yet, and we still definitely have a ways to go.
Absolutely. And then if you look at like on the national level, the CDC and others are talking about a resurgence as we sort of release these things before the virus or before the vaccine fully immunizes us. They're actually anticipating a surge. We're seeing that in several areas. How bad it's going to get, I'm not a doctor, an epidemiologist, so I'm not going to prognosticate. But the people that are waving some warning flags. And so if that happens, then we start contracting again on the private sector side, and that's unfortunate, to be honest. Some of the things we're tracking that are driving some concerns, even though we're starting to recover, online shopping, this is a problem, especially here in Alaska, right? I know it's easy. Heck, I've got my Amazon account. I love it too. But the problem with this is it's at unprecedentedly high levels across the nation. If you look at this, you can see that even 2021, as things are starting to relax and people are starting to shop in person again, it's still significantly higher even than it was in 2020. As people are starting to become more familiar with the platforms, and more importantly, more businesses are driving their business online. We're seeing a lot of our dollars go out of state and into the hands of Amazons, the Best Buys, things like that. There's nothing wrong with getting a good deal online, but the impact of that, especially when businesses are struggling so hard, is that those are lost dollars on almost every level, right? Very few of those dollars or cents stick here in the state. And every time that happens, that is just one more drag on our economy that keeps us from recovering as fast as we should. And the impact is pretty clear. This is Alaska specific data. Small businesses are working fewer or open fewer hours because of this. They're having to reduce hours 10% across the board on average. Because of reduced business, trying to drop operating costs, things along those lines. And then closures as well, a little over 10%, 13% of Alaska businesses are closed. As you can see, it could be worse. There's a whole swath there from Texas all the way up to the East Coast that looked like they've got 30% or more. This data is as of March 21st, 2021. But Alaska, 13%. I mean, our economy isn't as big as these other states. And so losing 1 in 10 businesses, even if it's only temporarily, is still a big hit to our economy and is going to be tough for us to recover from. We tend to come back slower than other places just because there's fewer of us. There's not as much, financial activity going on. And so if we lose 1 in 10 businesses permanently, it's going to be many, many years before we get back to where we were in 2019. And that's a real problem when you consider that the impacts of COVID-19 are going to happen or going to sort of echo for quite some time, unfortunately.
We actually had a question on this a couple of weeks ago. Last slide. Well, regarding small business closures, and if there was any data regarding the number of closures. So this is on a statewide basis?
It is. And the data here isn't perfect because we don't have really a good way to track this. What they've done is Moody's and CNN have gotten together with a company called Homebase, and they've used anecdotal evidence through financial subscriptions for like credit card processing payments and a few other factors, and cobbled together a statistical analysis of the businesses in the state. And their best guess is it's somewhere around 13%. So this isn't like a hard and fast black and white rule. It could be higher, could be slightly lower, but a ballpark, this is a pretty good. And we've heard this from ICER, we've heard this from CED, that their best estimates is somewhere in this range.
I mean, and the Romans had a word for it. It's decimation.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're not quite there yet. I think that's 9 out of 10 businesses would have to fail, but this is this is bad, right? I mean, 1 out of 10 businesses especially if you talk about the smaller communities, right? In rural communities, that is devastating. Like there's almost no way to come back from that in any, short term of time, unless you do a massive infusion of capital. And one of the things we've seen is that there has been an unprecedented amount of federal dollars pushed out into the United States in the last year. Almost $5 trillion across the board. And there's more bills coming. There's a $3 trillion infrastructure bill on its way. There's a handful of other appropriations bills that are coming, not necessarily COVID specific, but still part and parcel with the federal relief funds is going to be a really amazing amount of funding being dropped into these economies. This is a brief list of the 5 main sort of tranches of funding that have been deployed in the last year. It starts with a small emergency act that back when we had no idea how big this was going to get, 8.3 billion, followed by a few others, CARES Act, Coronavirus Aid, Relief and Economic Security Act, of course, being the first major distribution, 1.8 trillion. At the time, it was the largest peacetime relief act ever passed by Congress. Created several programs, the Paycheck Protection Program, the EIDL Advance Program, a handful of unemployment supplemental payments, individual payments, a bunch of other things, as well as capitalizing existing programs like the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. Most of those funds have been deployed. There's still a handful out there. I think the commercial fishing funding through the CARES Act here in Alaska is set to close here beginning of next month or something along those lines. But largely speaking, these funds have been exhausted, especially the business funds. Those have definitely passed. The good news was back in December when things were looking really bleak, quite frankly, all of the CARES funding was gone. The economy was still really, dark days. Businesses were desperately trying to find other options. Congress came together at the end of the year and managed to pass a bipartisan Consolidated Appropriations Act. This was another $900 billion. It recapitalized the PPP program. It recapitalized the unemployment assistance. And it created a new program, the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant, as well as a few others. And so those funds are starting to hit the street now, second round PPPs, things along those lines. But the SVOG, that doesn't open up until next month, the beginning of next month. And then there's a few other programs that'll be launching sort of as we go over the next month or so. And then last but not least, the new largest peacetime relief act passed by Congress is the American Rescue Plan Act, another $1.9 trillion passed just this last March. That includes recapitalization of quite a few programs, but also a bunch of new funding sources as well.
So John, I will say, just again, as an order of magnitude, a sense of scale. On the last slide, again, you say about $5 trillion. When this first hit, say in the March, April timeframe, I did some anecdotal research with just some friends of mine who own small businesses. And one of them said that, this is a small business, say under a dozen employees, that their payroll alone was $30,000 a month. And so I just started doing I put together a quick back of the napkin analysis where I started pulling kind of average numbers for small businesses. What's the average size of a small business, their average rent, their average payroll. And when I did that math, it came to $9 trillion. If you were going to just, encapsulate them and hold them hermetically sealed for a year. Yeah. And again, that was $9 trillion just for the small business sector. So these numbers are quite large, but they're not unreasonably so once you start doing the mathematics of need.
Right. And if you think about education, you think about infrastructure, healthcare, all of that. I mean, the large scale of this is almost unprecedented, honestly, from an economic impact standpoint. We've just never seen anything like this. But the good news is, I mean, it was a large tranche of money that allowed us to make it through. I mean, with all the numbers that we saw at the beginning of the presentation in terms of the impact, the financial magnitude, things along those lines, that's in the face of $5 trillion hitting the national economy. Now, without that, I can't imagine what would have happened. I mean, it would have been a catastrophic. Then we probably would have had decimation of our small businesses, quite frankly. This is this slide is a great example of why I am not a professional graphic designer. This is my best attempt to try and show you the various pots of CARES Act funding and how they were deployed across the state. We've organized it around our major centers, the SBDC centers, which is why, if you're asking why we picked these regions and cities, that's it. As you can see, Anchorage got the lion's share of the funding. Of all the funding sources, the Paycheck Protection Program was the largest for sure. And then followed by economic injury disaster loans in a lot of places, the Alaska CARES Act, Alaska CARES funding, through the states, and then local government funding as well. In Fairbanks, you can see that they've received around $200 million in federal funding through the CARES Act to their local businesses. On average, there was about 3,600 different distributions of funds, and they averaged around 56,000 per business. Now, this varies widely within the programs, and so the EIDL funds weren't necessarily the same magnitude as PPP, but broadly speaking, this indicates that the majority of businesses that received these funds were small businesses. They weren't large scale, several hundred employee type of things. And that's probably a good thing overall. There were other programs or other ways for the larger businesses to get assistance or to get financial relief. If you look at it, it's largely the amounts were fairly straightforward. It looks like they distributed the funds fairly consistently by population if you factor in that. It's not skewed necessarily one way or the other. There's some areas like the Kenai that seem to have done particularly well, say in the Alaska CARES grant receipts and things like that. But for the most part, I think the federal government did a very good job of making sure that this money was deployed as far and wide as it could be and really hit small and large communities alike. If you look at the distribution of just the PPP funds sort of by industry, this is a good analogy for jobs sort of retained. The PPP was primarily meant to be used to preserve payroll. If you look at healthcare was the largest dollar amount, accommodation and food services is the largest in terms of the jobs that were paid for through the funds. Construction, professional, scientific, and technical services, and retail trade round out the top 5. This is fairly consistent with the national numbers. The one thing that's missing here that you would see if you looked at U.S. numbers in general is manufacturing, and Alaska just doesn't really have much manufacturing, unfortunately. They do show up middle of the pack, which is interesting because of the small scale or the small number. I think there's only about 250 in the state. And so they did take advantage of the program. There's not enough of them to make a huge impact here. But the good news about sort of, say, healthcare getting a large portion of this is those jobs tend to be very well-paying jobs. So they were able to preserve high impact, economic impact jobs. Construction jobs as well can be very, very, very good. And then the accommodation and food services, that's just, that industry needed all the help it can get. So it was really, I liked seeing the fact that they were here. Nationally, they were the #1 recipient of PPP as well. All in, if you add all these up, it is, I think, north of 100,000 jobs. So that's how many jobs were impacted by the PPP program in the state. The second draw, Paycheck Protection Program, Alaska's been doing not as well on this, actually. If you look at our numbers there at the top, only 6,300 businesses have taken advantage of it. That's roughly half of the total that got the first round PPP. Net dollars, 536 million. If you look at all the different, do the math on all the different recipients, if you exclude the territories, that puts us in the bottom 4. Bottom 4 in terms of dollars received. So even if you factor in population, that's a bit disappointing. Part of the reasoning there is the first 2 weeks of the program, they really wanted to make sure that BIPOC businesses, underserved businesses, things along those lines received first crack at the money. And so they only allowed applications to be processed through CDFIs, minority business lending institutions, and 2 other specialized financial organizations. Unfortunately, Alaska only had a handful, I think 5 CDFIs, and none of them chose to participate in the PPP applications. So we missed out on the first 2 weeks of the application process, basically, which put us a little bit behind the rest of the nation. The good news is our financial institutions, North Rim, Wells Fargo, First National, Key, all the others have done a fantastic job of spending enough time and money and resources to process, able to step in and really hit the gas when they were allowed to and get those funds deployed. So I'm hopeful on a long enough timeline this will stabilize and we'll get back to where we should be, but it is a little disappointing that we're not quite where we should end up. Again, I will not be quitting my job to do graphic design anytime soon. This is our attempt to showcase how each community spent their CARES dollars allocation. So through the CARES Act, the state got about 1.2 billion. The various communities got a few hundred million to spend. There was pretty restricted. You couldn't use it for revenue replacement or things like that. You had to use it for a strict sort of selection of things. Most places spent a large portion of it on public health and safety. Almost all communities had some form of small business grant program. Housing support was a big one. this ties in, it's not the AHFC program, but on top of the AHFC program, a lot of local governments also had their own rent support program. There was medical supplies, PPE, telework, a bunch of other sort of factors where this money was distributed, but there was a theme through most of it. The small business grants in particular, I really thought were well done because the federal programs are a blunt instrument, right? There's a lot of industries that it didn't really suit well. A lot of it's particularly in Alaska, things along those lines. The state did a really bang up job creating the Alaska Cares program, trying to serve as a catch-all, but even there, it's still not as narrow and focused as you'd like on a local level. And so the local governments were able to go in there with a scalpel and say, all right, here is the particular industry or business type or what have you, and the particular needs they have. And they were able to really get in there and do some targeted deployment of funds, which I thought was very well done. Fairbanks in particular, actually, you guys killed it on this. You did a phenomenal job in terms of the grant funds that you had. I believe Brittany Smart was involved in that. She did great work. And beyond that, actually, I should mention real quick, your response and your material, Fairbanks in general, for the COVID-19 was some of the best in the state. We've seen them all. We were participate in a lot of the different planning groups, think tanks, things like that across the state. You had a phenomenal dashboard, a really well thought out plan for the future. A lot of others haven't. Anchorage is just now trying to figure theirs out, and it's been a year in. So that's, I actually, every time I met with them and they asked what I should do, I said, you should do what Fairbanks is doing because they have a really good platform. That whole website you have is just phenomenal. So anyway, well done on that.
Thanks, John. If we could pause just 1 second. Rich, yeah. Dr. Seifert, I see that you're off mute. Do you have a question, sir?
I'm typing it in the chat.
You're hot mic now. You might as well just go ahead and lob it out, sir.
Well, I just wanted to say it. I think some of the Fairbanks, you'll notice that the Fairbanks numbers are very high on medical. I think a lot, I'm on the Hospital Foundation board, so full disclosure, but I think a lot of the major reactions, the whole spectrum of things that happened in terms of community response was because of the Hospital Foundation and the hospital action. And it shows in that money because the hospital took an enormous hit having to deal with COVID at the same time not being able to charge for services or have any other services available and lots of other responsibilities. So, and you compare that to other places and, you know, it's somewhat comparable, but a lot of it is a matter of whether somebody has a hospital.
Well, if I could give some praise, yeah, the hospital really did step up here in the community. And as far as our programs, the borough was a little bit delayed in deployment of theirs, but what it did allow was the city came out fast. So we had a nice, some continuation of funding, which was, I believe, beneficial to the community as the successive waves of programs came through. And all three of the programs, as far as I know, made special accommodation to be able to repay the hospital as best they could for their very strong initial effort.
There was also a lot of confusion early on because of the second-class status and not being able to do medical services and healthcare obligations that caused a lot of slowness in repayments and compensations and whatever too. So it's all a mess.
Well, again, a mess, but thank you for your praise, John, because you've gotten to see, at least you have the frame of reference. Mr. Milne, Clark, I see that you're off mute. Do you have a question, sir?
Yes, and I appreciate it. And I think this is the right time to ask it. I've been wondering about the eventual audit ability, you know, of what will happen both nationally and then Alaska. Locally, as we've just said, I think there's been some effort to be pretty honest and forthright about our stuff. Of course, we always do a wonderful job, and that's mild sarcasm. We do our best, but I was wondering what Mr. Bittner thought, both crudely on a national scale, whether it will turn out that trying to take a blunt instrument, you know, where they leveraged and threw some money to the winds, and whether that'll work fairly well. And hopefully that Alaska will be at least average or better, you know, in terms of our eventual auditability.
Absolutely. So I actually am fairly confident on most of the funds that we deployed, especially the ones that were direct receipts from the federal government to state departments. I think that'll turn out okay. I think that there might be some problems with some of the smaller communities and their ability to understand federal requirements. At the end of the day, though, like as long as it was a good faith effort, like I really just have difficulty believing the federal government is going to come into like Anaktuvik Pass and really start, banging on doors and threatening people in the middle of a pandemic. Like I think it's more along the lines of if there is willful malfeasance. And you saw that when like the LA Lakers got a PPP program check. You saw it when like Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, right? People were kind of angry about that. And so that generated a lot of public outcry, and that, these companies actually ended up ponying up the money and giving it back before anything bad happened. The one thing that I'm not sure about is apparently Alaska is one of the first tranche of states that's going to get the deep dive CARES funding audit through Treasury. And the reason they gave, at least my understanding is, and this is not my area of expertise, but the reason they gave is that they got an above average number of complaints about how the money was used. I'm assuming by the people, by the population. One of two things this could be. One is people were really upset with how the money was deployed, not necessarily because it was deployed against the wishes or the rules of the programs, but they just didn't like how they were doing it. And so they decided to call the federal government. The federal was like, well, we should probably look at that. Or maybe there is some malfeasance out there. I couldn't find it, to be honest. Like we've been very heavily involved in the Alaska CARES program. We've been heavily involved in a lot of these local government programs. If you see this breakdown here, I mean, most of these all fall into the same buckets. And the reason is that's the ones that you can use it for. So I'm not super worried about the audit. I mean, it may find a handful of things, but I don't think it's going to be anywhere near as bad as it could be, honestly.
There was quite a bit of contention simply with the appropriation process. Might that be a factor?
I don't think so. I think that could be a factor on the state level, and we did see some lawsuits around that. That's more of an internal housekeeping issue. We had some real weird. It was just a weird political season, right? I mean, we weren't able to come together on how to deploy the funds. There was some confusion about whether or not it had to be through a legislative appropriation or if the governor could use the appeal process. It got messy, which is unfortunate. But, I mean, I think that it was a good learning curve for this round of funding, right? I mean, now we know, I hope we know. I don't speak for the legislature, but I think that we've done this dance before. And so now they have a better understanding of what to expect and how to sort of make sure the money is deployed. One of the things that I do want to mention, and this kind of ties into some of that delay, both on a state level and a local level in terms of figuring out how to deploy the money, et cetera, et cetera. At the time, I think there was a lot of frustration. People were like, geez, let's just get this money on the street all at once. What ended up happening, though, was the funds through no like grand design, but just sort of happenstance, happened to be deployed in discrete tranches spread out over time. So at the beginning, the EIDL program, which was a pre-existing SBA program, was the only game in town. Everything else was still, they were trying to figure out how to do it. And so there was a large number of EIDL loans made early on. People took a lot of those to try and hedge their bets and make sure that they were financially safe going forward. Then the PPP program launched and everyone got into that. And you saw a huge sort of upswing in the number of PPP loans grants made over that time period. As that started, either people started not being eligible anymore, or the funding was starting to drop. You saw the Alaska CARES program jumped in towards the end of that, and it's not shown on this, unfortunately, on this graph. Oh no, it is Alaska CARES on here. I think. No, it's not. I apologize. It should be on here, but it's not. If it were on here, somewhere around September is about when those funds would pop. And so, just out of pure luck, we were able to pulse the money out in about 3-month increments, which allowed us to get these businesses not all the money they needed, but enough money to keep them going for the next quarter, and again, and again, and again. And that's why at December, when all of the pots of money were sort of exhausted, local government funding sort of spread out throughout this whole time period. It was a little worrying because there was nothing on the horizon, so we weren't sure what else to do. We're in the home stretch, so bear with me. We're almost there. The American Rescue Plan Act, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's here. There's a lot here. This isn't a comprehensive list. This is just the ones that I think are of particular interest to Alaska. It increased some funding, small amount of funding for the PPP, but it did expand eligibility to include a few folks that were left behind, nonprofits and private sector business types. Nothing major there. It also added another $15 billion for the targeted EIDL advance. This is the up to $10,000 basically free and clear grant that was created through the CARES Act. This one's much more limited though. It's only for businesses that are in certain low-income areas that fit certain criteria. So it's much more for the very small businesses and not just for everybody. It also added another $1.2 billion in additional funding for the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant. These are for live venues, theaters, things along those lines. This grant will actually open up in, I think on the 8th. So if anybody in your area is interested in this, it's a good idea to try and get your fund or get your package put together beforehand, because I think there's going to be a lot of interest in this particular program. The theaters had a pretty hard time accessing the other pots of capital, so they've still got a lot of liabilities and not a lot of support. The underlined bullets at the end here are brand new programs that were created through the ARPA. There's a restaurant revitalization fund. We're very excited about this. We don't have a deadline for when it's going to open yet, but it is for restaurants and bars up to $10 million per business. It includes a lot of the same eligible expenses as the PPP, but it also includes food and beverage purchases. So there's a Venn diagram at the end of this that I'll show you that shows you the differences, but that's a very exciting one, and we hope that launches soon. The Community Navigator program is not necessarily for businesses, but it is for technical support agencies. So EDOs, SBDCs, local governments, things like that, I believe will be eligible to receive a certain amount of money to help provide technical assistance to underserved businesses in their region. So when this launches, that'll be a good opportunity for organizations, quite frankly, like I think FEDC might be eligible to receive a little money to help support businesses. And then last but not least, there's $410 billion for a state small business credit initiative. This is run through the Treasury, and each state can develop its own financial mechanism, loan participation, equity, all sorts of different tools targeted to what their particular area needs, provide an additional financial mechanism to businesses in their state. So we're not sure what the state of Alaska has planned in terms of identifying a way for that money to be deployed here, but that's another source of funding that could be on the horizon. State and local government funding, the state's going to get about $1.25 billion. Local governments are going to get about $250 million. It looks like Fairbanks has, based on their population, is going to be allocated somewhere south of $19 million plus another $3.7 million for transit. Anchorage and Fairbanks were the only two that got a direct disbursement for transit that I can find. But again, it's another $21 million that's going to be coming into the community. And like I said, the funds here are a lot more flexible than the CARES Act funding. So you can do a lot more with it. Fairbanks doesn't have the same issue that a lot of the other communities I mentioned have of being underwater when it comes to the amount of money they're receiving versus budget issues. So they'll actually be able to, I suspect, get fairly creative with this funding and more targeted. This is a big one, $370 million for K-12 schools to go back to in-person classes. This is going to help get our workforce back in their offices. If you have your kids at home and you're trying to homeschool them, it's very difficult to also hold down a full-time job at the office. So this is going to help our workforce out. Individual assistance, there's a lot of money here, $5 billion for emergency housing vouchers for the homeless, $1.2 billion for rent funding for low-income tenants, trying to help that large number of renters that have back payments. Another individual payment disbursement. This money has actually already hit the streets. It's one of the only tranches of the ARPA that has been deployed so far. And then the child tax credit and unemployment supplements as well. And then there's COVID-19 vaccine and testing funding in a variety of different tranches, about $2 billion all in. That's going to help Alaska maintain its momentum in terms of getting vaccinated. This is the portal for the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant. Like I said, it opens up on the 8th. This is a good one for the folks that are eligible. It's up to $10 million here as well. It's going to start with organizations that have lost 95% or more of their revenue versus same time last year, then 75, then 25 or 50, something like that. So they're going to do it in tranches based on need. And this is the Restaurant Relief Fund. For example, the circle on the right is second draw PPP. Circle on the left is the Restaurant Relief Fund, and in the middle, traditional Venn diagram. But I think this is going to be a really important source of funding for restaurants and bars who are still fairly hard hit right now. They took it in the teeth last year, and it's taking them a lot to recover. So this is going to help a lot of them sort of get through the next bit. The one thing I will mention, it looks like you need either a DUNS or a SAMS number to apply for this particular tranche of funding. Most businesses don't have it, and that is a bit of a time-consuming process. So if you know any restaurants and bars who want to take advantage of this, you might want to advise them to start that process now, because I do think this is going to be a wildly popular program.
Can you repeat what
business? I'm sorry?
Can you just, on the last slide, can you just repeat what they will need? A DUNS?
DUNS or SAMS number. It's a Duns and Bradstreet, basically a identifier, or a SAMS number. It's something you normally only need if you're doing grants to the government. Most private businesses don't ever need one. And so you have to apply through the federal government, and it's not just set the application and we're done. They have to send you something back with your information. And so if everybody in the restaurant and bar industry starts to do that at the same time, I imagine it's going to be a bit of a crunch factor, unfortunately. So they're going to have to get in soon. Like I said, we don't know when this is going to launch, but you're not going to want to wait till the last minute.
Tanya Klukas from Rep Hopkins' office just put what an email address, not email address, but a website address in the chat box. Okay, just wanted to know. So,
good.
Do we have any feel for what the turnaround time to receive one is?
It's not fast before this program launched, right? And so I think that this is going to unleash a flood of applications for this number. So I suspect it's hope for the best, but plan for the worst, I guess, is what I'm trying to fumblingly trying to tell you here. And that's what we're advising our clients, is to get in there and try and take care of this quickly, because they may end up changing that. Usually when there's a pain point like this, they're trying to be responsive, but I've just found it's better to be safe than sorry.
Do you know if they're doing certain reserves for states, holding certain, carving out and holding certain pots of money, at least to allow states, businesses within states to be responsive? Or is it just one big pot and first come, first served?
For this program, it's one big pot, first come, first serve is our understanding, but they're still releasing the details. So, but I suspect it's just going to be first come, first serve. The SVOG, they did try to do it in tranches based on impact. The PPP, they did that a little bit with the initial. So they're trying, but again, it's different. It's a blend instrument, right? I mean, it's hard to get, a real nuanced reaction when you're working on this scale. And so that's, I think, where the state and local funding hopefully would come in.
Thank you, sir.
No worries. Last but not least, I think there's only like one or two slides here. Basically, this is the business survey results. We ran this back in December. Over 500 businesses participated. We asked them what the top 3 challenges were. Obviously, COVID-19, that was a given. The economy and operating costs, though, were still a big factor. And the operating cost one is something that eventually we're going to have to, as an economy, really step up and address, because there are certain fundamental drags on operating a business in Alaska that have been the same. If you look at an economic development book from the 60s and 70s, it's the exact same issues as it is today. And that's just, we have to figure this out. We have to figure out transportation costs, workforce costs, energy costs. Like, until we can, it's just very difficult for us to scale our economic development in any meaningful fashion. And it also prevents businesses from opening here. When you look at our cost of operating versus almost anywhere else in the nation, it's just hard to make that case. Here's a breakdown when we asked them what the company's financial situation would be in the next 12 months. Now, keep in mind, this is after the majority of the CARES funding was deployed. So this is after they've received PPP, EIDL Advance, Alaska CARES, local funding. Across the board, negative outweighed the positive for the first time in the history of the survey. And if you look at Fairbanks, about 37% were poor or very poor. So basically 4 in 10 businesses were deeply concerned about where their financial position was going to be in the next year. 30%, neither good nor poor, but you still have very strong showing in the good and very good. Where you see even the numbers the worst, Juneau, Ketchikan, This is largely because those communities depend so heavily on the tourism industry. Anywhere where the tourism industry is a major factor in the local economy or in the local government funding, you are seeing an exponentially worse financial situation, just because that industry just took it so hard this year. It was terrible. And this year, we're hopeful that their independent travelers are going to offset that somewhat. The buy local movements are going to help, encouraging Alaskans to explore Alaska, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, cruise ship passengers bring a significant number of people to the state, and it's very difficult to replace that on a onesie, twosie basis. We asked them what policymakers could do to help. Not shocking, funding, number one with a bullet. I mean, this is a situation unlike most other downturns. It's not because of anything the business is doing. It's not like their business plan is bad. The entire economy on a global level shut down. And really the only thing to get them through it was just expenses, right? What I did think was interesting was the next two, sort of other than unsure, there were 50-50 split between the businesses that wanted us to unlock everything and reduce the COVID-19 restrictions, go back to normal, and the people that wanted us to lock down harder and hold things down so we could get rid of COVID and go back to normal. Like I actually thought it was going to skew one way or the other, but apparently even the business community is kind of split on the whole, whether or not we should lock down or release more, which I did not see coming. And that's it. I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time, but there's
excellent presentation.
Yep.
No, John, no apologies. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we do have a good solid, 10, 12 minutes left. And so I would simply open up the floor to questions. I see we do have a policymaker online, Senator Kawasaki or his office. I also see Ms. Klukas and I believe Mr. Hardbrook as well. So I would open it up first to policymakers or their staffs if you have any questions.
Hey, Jomo. Hey, John. I don't have any questions, but thanks for being online this morning. It was important and timely that we hear about this.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Hardenbrook.
This is Joe Hardenbrook from Rep. Hopkins' office. The Senate Finance Committee had a very good overview on sort of the first data from ARPA last week, and we've been reaching out to the borough in our office to talk to them about what they envision as opportunities for the funds coming in. And just to reiterate something that Mr. Bittner said, flexibility is key. You know, each municipality is looking at different challenges and hoping to use different tools. And the main flexibility that they spoke about was, being able to use funds for operating or capital expenses so that they can, to hijack the president's term, build back better. So they're looking forward to some of the flexibility in this latest round of funding and putting it to work and putting it on the streets.
Hey, Joe, before you mute, so you said there was a presentation on same subject, again, deep dive into the funding itself. And I believe you said one of the finance committees.
The Senate Finance Committee had a hearing last week. I'll grab the link here and post it into the chat.
Thank you, sir. More information, the better. Mr. Seifert, Doc, I'd see that you would come off of mute.
Yeah. You're talking to me, Rich Seifert?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw a review in Dermot Cole's blog about how much of this could offset expenses and help balance the budget in the state. There's an enormous amount of money coming in, and Dermot does a really good balancing act, saying what may or may not happen and whatever. It's very, very insightful. But I wondered what maybe some of the legislators, the policymakers, as you said online, would say about that. And the government had promised that all this money would appear in August, and nobody really knows what money that was. But I just wondered if once again the magic of government comes through with federal influx of money, and maybe everybody breathes easy for a while. Any reactions to that?
Hi, Rich. This is Scott. When we heard that there's roughly $1.2 $1.3 billion come into the state. We're still trying to figure out exactly how that money is utilized for state, but it definitely took a lot of pressure off the legislature this year to try and find a long-term fiscal plan. I can also tell you that the GO bond bill has some problems coming in just because we're waiting on federal money for the big transportation infrastructure bill, which may be coming out by the end of the federal fiscal year. So it definitely has taken the pressure off of trying to find a long-term solution. I think that the House recognizes that this is a one-time only tranche of money that we're going to be getting, but I know in the Senate, there wasn't really a lot of appetite for taxes in the first place.
Yeah, I don't know that a delay of our reckoning is a good thing.
I didn't intend for it to be a good thing. I'm just saying people need to recognize what's happening here. Once again, we get a little slide by money and put off the can kicking down the road here. I mean,
yeah.
It's just tragic.
Got it. Yeah, thanks, Rich.
What's interesting about the state and local funding is that unlike the CARES Act, which had to be spent within a very short timeline, I believe the timeline on the other tranches of funding through ARPA is extended to 2024. So theoretically, you could have pots of this funding for multiple years, but it depends on sort of how much you need now versus later. I think the odds of getting another relief act like this passed are pretty slim. I think this is probably the last tranche of this magnitude. After this, it's going to be more on recovery funds, which is infrastructure, growth, and healthcare, things along those lines. So I don't think we're going to see something like this again.
Well, I will tell you, right around this time last year, I got to sit on a presentation with Alaska Brass Military, and their timeline, their estimated timeline for when we would be in a position to start moving into quote unquote the new normal was 12 to 18 months. And I'm finding that that is lining up. That would put us right about now or into the June timeframe. And that's, that has turned out to be fairly prescient. I wish I told more policymakers then. And again, you also heard about my back of the napkin regarding, again, the scale of the potential need. And I really wish I had gone ahead and I wish I'd ignored Jim and written that op-ed back in last March, April. But again, it is nice that these things are coming through and the assistance is on the way and that it has been provided because it was needed. Do you have any further insights or, anything you'd like to share, John?
And one last thing that I want to sort of drive home is that we are transitioning out of, catastrophe mode into more targeted, now we have to get down to the nuance of who got left behind. And, partly it's going to be the tourism industry is just really, really hanging by a thread. I'm very concerned about that. And that has impacts on local government levels, state government levels. I mean, there's a cascading sort of issue there that we really need to try and address through marketing, through attraction, through local tourism. I think there's a case to be made, quite frankly, that now is the best time to come to Alaska. We have extremely high vaccination rates. We have a lot of space to go in. And if you wanted to go see whatever the biggest tourist attraction we've got and not be elbow to elbow with a cruise ship load of passengers, this is the year to do it, right? I mean, my family and we're scheduling things that I would normally be like, I don't know if I really want to get in there and combat fish, I'm going to do something else. This year though, I mean, why not, man, right? It's a great idea. Last summer, there was an effort along these lines and it actually did really well, especially in Homer and Seward. If you look at their sales tax data, it is nowhere near as bad as it should have been if they lost all those tourists. But a lot of Alaskans and a lot of independent tourists came in there and made the difference. I think that's the kind of effort that we need to focus on. The other thing is we have to figure out how to stabilize the local governments and how to make sure that they are allowed to get through this next year, just like the businesses had to get through last year, right? I mean, if we can just hold the line on the private sector and hold the line on the government sector, I think next year, 2022 is when we really, are back chugging full speed ahead and going forward. But we have to preserve what we have now. Because like I said, whatever we lose takes us, one day to lose it, it takes us 10 years to get it back. Like it is just not easy to recover from these types of economic downturns, historically speaking. And that's in a normal year. And this is anything but normal. So That's my 2 cents. We do the Buy Alaska program. I think we're partnered with you guys on that, actually. If I've
Yeah,
got
very much. We just put another op-ed in the paper on Sunday for you.
I appreciate it. That radio spot you guys did for us is amazing too. We're using that as a template going forward for other regions. So anything we can do, we're here to partner with y'all. We are really free, cheap, easy to use. So if there's anything we can do to support any of your efforts there, what you're doing in Fairbanks, like I said, I'm super impressed with how you guys handled this. I think you did a hell of a job in terms of planning for the future, identifying issues, getting the information out there, deploying your funds. Like, I just really think you were a model for the rest of the state. So well done, and we'd love to support you more.
Thanks, John. I see Clark has taken himself off mute. Clark, do you have something for us?
Just super briefly, I was going to ask John, very heartening to hear, Homer and Seward. It made me think though, any data that you observed from a little more, not exotic, but that next step out, and it made me think of Nome and Barrow and that kind of thing.
Yeah, those communities are again, I think they're on the list of folks that are having some difficulties in terms of their budgets versus how much they're getting from the ARPA. There's about 40 or so communities that are underwater. I don't have the list in front of me, but it's going to be a lot of communities. Like if you look at Ketchikan, that's a good one. There was just an article, I think it was last week or so, from K2 saying they've got a $9 million budget liability and they're getting $1.2 million through the ARPA. So their city manager is suggesting, look, I would love to put this money into all sorts of crazy stuff, but realistically, we got to pay our bills. So 100% of that funding, he's advocating for using 100% of that funding for their budget deficit. And then they're still 7.8 million shy, right? I mean, what are you going to do in a community that size that's already taken it in the teeth because they heavily rely on tourism and other industries that were particularly hard hit? Like, it's just, that's my biggest concern, right? I mean, what do we do to stabilize that? Because that's not going to be easy. And the state itself, I mean, problems, right? I mean, how do they manage their own issues? So it's just, I wish there had been a little more money on the local level based on need versus population necessarily, because I think that that's where our smaller communities really got shortchanged, unfortunately.
Well, and
Thank you.
You mentioned, I've heard that the city of Fairbanks, city of North Pole, and the FNSB have weathered this fairly well, but I thought I had heard that the school district was facing a major shortfall. And so that I don't know that falls under the 40 communities.
No, that's it. So the 40 communities are mainly just overall budgets. I think the schools are a separate issue, and that is a bit of a problem. Although there was a significant amount of funding in the ARPA for them. The university should also get some funding, although I think it was in the Bradner report. They mentioned that there may be an issue based on how they calculate, like you're not allowed to use that fund and then the next year have the budget drop. So they calculate an average based on 2017 to 2019. And because we've got that built-in budget reduction agreement with the governor, that may actually preclude us from being able to use that money is what the Bradner say. This is outside of my realm of understanding. I don't know much about it, but I think it was their last report. They called that out. And if that's an issue, that's really not great if we can't accept that money or if we have to do something creative there.
Okay. And I guess the only last question I had was relative to the business closures. And if within that 13%, if there was any granularity regarding kind of what businesses closed or what kinds, if there was more data underneath the aggregate 13%.
Yeah, it's I don't have the actual breakdowns, but it's going to be the restaurants and bars. It's going to be the tourism industry. It's going to be the smaller retailers. And in some cases, it's going to be the smaller care healthcare providers, the ones that were sort of on the margins. That's my understanding of where it is. And there's no guarantee that those are closed indefinitely. Some of those may just be closed temporarily, and then if things improve or they're able to get another tranche of funding, they can reopen. But yeah, those are the ones that are hardest hit. So I would expect to see the largest numbers of closures.
Yeah, solid assumption. Well, John, again, Mr. Bittner, thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you so much for your hard work. And yes, the hard work of your organization, the good things that you will have been doing. It's very, very much appreciated. And I know that the general public doesn't get to see it quite as often or well as we do here at SBDC because we work with you so closely. But we have been able to see it. And again, it's deeply appreciated. And you all have been doing a bang up job.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
boss. All right, everybody. That's it for today. Again, thank you to Mr. Bittner and the gang over at the Alaska Small Business Development Center. I have always been doing good work. But again, at this time of in this time of crisis, they have stepped up like so many others for their community, our community, and for our state, and it's much appreciated. I actually don't have anything on the docket for the next week. I'll be scrambling around to find something, but I'll do my best as always. And either way, just everybody have a great rest of your day, a great week, and yep, y'all stay safe, healthy, and happy, and shovel that snow.
Have a good one.
See you guys.